The howling wind whipped across the open plain, burying everything in sight under a blanket of white as Brody Quinn hunched lower in his saddle. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, transforming the familiar Montana landscape into an unrecognizable wasteland in a matter of hours. It was December 1887, and he was a long way from shelter. Brody pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting through the relentless curtain of snow. At 32, he'd weathered his share of Montana winters, but this storm had a particular viciousness to it. His horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Cooper, trudged forward with his head lowered against the biting wind. "Just a bit further, boy," Brody muttered, his words immediately swallowed by the howling gale. He'd left his small ranch that morning when the sky had been clear, riding out to check on a section of fence along the northern boundary of his property. The storm had rolled in fast from the mountains, catching him unprepared and far from home. Now, with daylight fading fast, Brody knew he needed to find shelter soon, or risk freezing to death in the open. A sound carried on the wind so faint, he almost missed it. Brody reined Cooper to a halt, tilting his head to listen. There it was again, a cry that didn't belong to the wind or any animal he knew. It sounded human. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "Anyone out there?" The cry came again, louder this time. Brody turned Cooper toward the sound, pushing through a drift that reached the horse's chest. As they crested a small rise, he spotted a dark shape against the snow, the remnants of what appeared to be a small wagon, its canvas cover torn and flapping wildly in the wind. "Hello," he called again, dismounting and trudging toward the wagon. A woman's face appeared in the opening of the torn canvas, her features pale with cold and fear. Her eyes widened at the sight of him. "Oh, thank God," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Please help us." Brody reached the wagon in 3 long strides. Inside, the woman clutched a small bundle to her chest, a baby, wrapped in what looked like the woman's own shawl. Both were shivering violently. "Madam, what happened? Are you hurt?" Brody asked, quickly assessing the situation. "Our wagon wheel broke," she explained through chattering teeth. "My husband went for help hours ago, before the storm got bad. He hasn't returned." Brody glanced around, seeing no sign of another person. The situation was dire. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wagon offered little protection from the elements. "I'm Brody Quinn," he said, making a quick decision. "I've got a line shack about 2 miles from here. We need to get you both there now." Without waiting for a response, Brody shrugged out of his heavy buffalo fur coat and wrapped it around the woman and child. "What's your name, madam?" "Katherine Miller," she replied, clutching the baby tighter. "And this is Emma. She's only 4 months old." "Well, Miss Katherine, we need to move fast. Is there anything in this wagon you absolutely need?" Katherine glanced around at their few possessions. "Just the bag there. It has Emma's things." Brody grabbed the small carpet bag and secured it to Cooper's saddle. Then he turned back to Katherine. "I'm going to help you onto my horse, and then I'll lead us to safety. Hold tight to your little one." Katherine nodded, her face resolute despite her obvious exhaustion. Brody lifted her with ease, surprised at how light she felt in his arms. He settled her sideways in the saddle, making sure the buffalo coat was wrapped securely around both her and the baby. "What about my husband?" Katherine asked, looking back at the wagon. "Thomas said he'd return." Brody's expression was grim. "If he's out in this, madam—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the odds. "We can send a search party when the storm breaks. Right now, we need to get you and your baby to safety." Taking Cooper's reins, Brody began leading them through the snow. The wind had picked up even more, driving icy particles into his face like tiny needles. Without his coat, the cold cut through his wool shirt and vest, but he set his jaw against the discomfort. The woman and baby needed the warmth more than he did. Katherine cradled Emma close, trying to shield the infant's face from the biting wind. The baby had stopped crying, which worried her. She checked frequently beneath the heavy fur to make sure Emma was still breathing. "How much further?" Katherine called, after what seemed like an eternity of trudging through ever-deepening snow. "Not far now," Brody assured her, though the line shack seemed to be taking longer to reach than he'd anticipated. The storm had disoriented him somewhat, but he pressed on, following landmarks he recognized even beneath their coating of white. Finally, a dark shape materialized through the curtain of snow, the small, sturdy outline of the line shack Brody maintained for when he needed to work the far reaches of his ranch. "There it is," he called, relief evident in his voice. The one-room cabin was basic but solid, built to withstand the harsh Montana winters. Brody pushed open the door, quickly ushering Katherine and Emma inside before securing Cooper in the small lean to attach to the side of the shack. Inside, Katherine stood shivering in the center of the room, still clutching Emma to her chest. Brody moved quickly, striking a match to light the lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. In its warm glow, he could see Katherine clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with dark hair escaping from beneath a knitted cap. Her face, though pinched with cold and worry, was strikingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and expressive eyes the color of summer sage. "Let me get a fire going," Brody said, turning to the small iron stove in the corner. He worked efficiently, laying kindling and logs from the stack beside the stove, and soon had a fire crackling. "Come closer to the heat," he urged, pulling the room's only chair near the stove for Katherine. She sank into it gratefully, loosening the buffalo coat enough to check on Emma. The baby stirred, making small whimpering sounds that were the most welcome noise Katherine had heard all day. "She's all right," Katherine whispered, relief washing over her face. "I was so afraid." "Babies are tougher than they look," Brody said, smiling slightly as he took a worn blanket from the single bed in the corner and draped it over Katherine's shoulders. "And she has a good mother looking after her." Katherine looked up at him, truly seeing her rescuer for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair fell in damp waves to his collar, and his eyes, a deep blue like a summer sky, regarded her with kindness. "Thank you," she said softly. "We would have died out there if you hadn't found us." Brody shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "But it wasn't anyone. It was you." Katherine's voice broke slightly. "And I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No need for that," Brody replied, turning to a small cupboard. "Let's see about getting you and the little ones some food. Then we can figure out our next steps." As Brody moved around the small cabin, gathering supplies and heating water on the stove, Katherine watched him. There was a gentleness to his movements that belied his rugged appearance. He prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky, apologizing for the lack of variety. "This is the finest meal I've seen in days," Katherine assured him, accepting the tin plate gratefully. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the howling of the wind outside and the occasional pop from the stove. When Katherine had finished, she attended to Emma, feeding the baby and changing her from the supplies in the bag Brody had salvaged. "You should take the bed," Brody said, nodding toward the narrow cot in the corner. "I'll make do on the floor." "I couldn't put you out of your bed," Katherine protested. "It's no trouble. I've slept on worse." Katherine reluctantly agreed, settling onto the cot with Emma nestled beside her. Brody added more wood to the stove, then made a pallet for himself on the floor, using his saddle blanket and a spare coat. As the storm raged on outside, the little cabin grew warm and comfortable. Katherine found herself studying the man who had saved them. There was something about Brody Quinn that inspired trust, a steadiness in his manner, a quiet confidence in his movements. "Tell me about your husband," Brody said suddenly, his voice low in the dimly lit room. "Which direction did he head?" Katherine's expression clouded. "East, toward the town he thought was there. Millerville, he called it." Brody frowned. "Millerville is more than 15 miles from here." "Is it?" Katherine sighed, closing her eyes briefly. "Thomas was never very good with directions. He was determined to get us to Oregon, said there was land for the taking there." "Oregon's a long way from Montana, especially with winter setting in," Brody observed. "I told him we should wait until spring, but he insisted we could make it before the worst weather." A tear slipped down Katherine's cheek. "He's not a bad man, just impulsive, dreamful." Brody nodded, not voicing his thoughts on a man who would take his wife and infant child on such a journey as winter approached. "When the storm breaks, I'll head out to look for him." "Thank you," Katherine whispered, though her voice held little hope. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the small cabin, warmth and exhaustion soon lulled Katherine and Emma to sleep. Brody lay awake longer, listening to their soft breathing and wondering what twist of fate had brought them to his door. Morning brought an eerie stillness. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that glittered in the early sunlight. Brody rose quietly, careful not to wake Katherine and Emma as he stoked the fire and prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and Johnny cakes. The smell of coffee roused Katherine. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, until her eyes found Brody by the stove. "Good morning," he said softly. "How's the little one?" Katherine glanced down at Emma, who was still sleeping peacefully. "She's fine, thanks to you." "Hungry? It's not much, but it's hot." Katherine nodded, carefully placing Emma on the bed, surrounded by blankets, before joining Brody at the small table. She accepted the tin mug of coffee gratefully, wrapping her slender fingers around it for warmth. "The storm's passed," Brody said, nodding toward the window where sunlight streamed in. "After breakfast, I'll head out to look for your husband." Katherine's expression was a mix of hope and resignation. "I appreciate that, but I fear the worst." "Don't give up hope yet," Brody said, though privately he shared her concern. A man on foot in yesterday's blizzard faced nearly impossible odds. After breakfast, Brody prepared to leave. He saddled Cooper, filled his canteen, and strapped on his gun belt, a precaution he rarely went without. "There's plenty of wood for the fire," he told Katherine, "and food in the cupboard. I should be back before dark." Katherine stood in the doorway, Emma now awake and bundled in her arms. "Please be careful." "I will," Brody promised, tipping his hat before mounting Cooper and setting off across the snow-covered landscape. He rode first to the abandoned wagon, hoping to pick up Thomas Miller's trail from there. The wagon sat as they had left it, half buried in snow. Brody circled the area, looking for any sign of which direction Thomas had taken. After finding what appeared to be faint tracks heading east, Brody followed, his eyes scanning the unbroken white expanse for any sign of movement or color. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow into a blinding sea of white that made his eyes water. Hours passed with no sign of Thomas Miller. Brody pushed on, knowing that with each passing hour, the chances of finding Katherine's husband alive diminished. By midday, he had covered several miles in an expanding search pattern. It was Cooper who alerted him first, the horse's ears pricking forward as he snorted softly. Brody followed the animal's gaze and spotted a dark shape against the snow near a stand of bare cottonwoods. Drawing closer, Brody's heart sank. A man lay face down in the snow, one arm outstretched as if he had been reaching for something in his final moments. Brody dismounted and approached slowly, though he already knew what he would find. Thomas Miller had frozen to death, likely disoriented by the blizzard and exhausted from trudging through deep snow. Brody knelt beside the body, respectfully removing his hat. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with the soft hands of someone unaccustomed to physical labor. He wore city clothes, unsuitable for the harsh Montana winter, another indication of his lack of preparation for the journey he had undertaken. With a heavy sigh, Brody set about the grim task of retrieving the body. He couldn't leave Thomas Miller to the elements and wild animals. Katherine deserved the chance to say goodbye to her husband properly. Using a blanket from his saddlebag, Brody wrapped the frozen body as best he could, then secured it across Cooper's back. The journey back to the line shack was slow and solemn. The only sounds the crunch of snow beneath Cooper's hooves and the occasional call of a winter bird. As the cabin came into view, Brody rehearsed in his mind how to break the news to Katherine. There was no easy way to tell a woman she was now a widow. Katherine must have been watching for him, for she opened the door before he had even dismounted. Her eyes immediately went to the blanket-wrapped bundle across Cooper's back, and her face crumpled. "Thomas?" she whispered, though it wasn't really a question. Brody nodded grimly, dismounting and approaching her. "I'm sorry, Katherine. I found him about 7 miles east." He was heading in the right direction, but the storm was too much. Katherine stood very still, one hand pressed to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, but didn't fall. "I knew," she said quietly. "Somehow, I knew when he didn't come back yesterday." Brody reached out awkwardly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll take care of everything. You don't need to see him like this." Katherine nodded mutely, then turned and went back inside, to where Emma lay in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden crate and blankets. Brody set about the necessary task. With the ground frozen solid, burial would have to wait for spring. But there was a small storage shed behind the cabin where the body could be kept. He worked quickly, treating Thomas Miller with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. When he returned to the cabin, Katherine sat in the chair by the stove, her face pale but composed as she gently rocked Emma's cradle with her foot. "I've placed him in the shed," Brody said, removing his hat as he entered. "When the ground thaws, we can give him a proper burial." "Thank you," Katherine replied, her voice steady, though barely above a whisper. "You've been so kind to us, Mr. Quinn." "Brody, please," he corrected gently. "Brody," she repeated, offering a small, sad smile. "I don't know what we're going to do now. Thomas had all our money with him." Brody pulled up a wooden crate to sit opposite her. "Don't worry about that right now. You and Emma can stay here as long as you need to." "That's very generous, but we can't impose on you indefinitely." "It's no imposition," Brody assured her. "My ranch house is about 5 miles south of here. Once you're feeling up to it, I can take you there. It's more comfortable than this place." Katherine looked around the small cabin that had become their sanctuary. "This place saved our lives." "It seems quite comfortable to me." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with the weight of the day's events. Outside, the sun began its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the snow. "If you don't mind," Katherine said eventually, "I'd like to know more about the man who saved us." Brody shifted, unaccustomed to talking about himself. "Not much to tell. I came out here from Pennsylvania about 10 years ago. Worked cattle drives for a few years, then managed to save enough to buy my own small spread. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine." "Family?" Katherine asked. "Parents are gone. Got a sister back east. Married with kids. We write sometimes." Brody shrugged. "Most ranchers out here are solitary sorts. It must get lonely." "You get used to it," Brody said, though there was a hint of something in his voice that suggested otherwise. Katherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Thomas and I met in Chicago. He worked for a merchant, had big dreams of owning his own business someday. When we heard about the land in Oregon..." She trailed off, fresh grief washing over her face. "You don't have to talk about it now," Brody said gently. "No, it's all right. Thomas was a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity. Sure that fortune was waiting just around the corner." Katherine smiled sadly. "When I told him I was expecting Emma, he was determined to make a better life for us. That's why we set out for Oregon." "That's a worthy goal," Brody offered. "Yes, but Thomas never quite understood the practical side of things. He thought we could make the journey before winter, even though we got a late start. When I expressed concerns, he assured me we'd be fine." Katherine's voice broke slightly. "Now he's gone, and Emma and I are stranded in the middle of nowhere." "You're not stranded," Brody said firmly. "You're safe. And we'll figure out what comes next together." Katherine looked up, surprise and gratitude mingling in her expression. "Why would you do that for us? You don't even know us." Brody considered the question. Why indeed was he so willing to help this woman and her child? Perhaps it was simply the decent thing to do. Or perhaps it was the way Katherine's presence had already begun to fill a void in his life he hadn't fully acknowledged. "Out here, we help each other," he said finally. "It's how we survive." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Brody rose early, as was his habit, and found Katherine already awake, feeding Emma by the stove's warmth. "I need to head back to my ranch today," Brody announced after breakfast. "Check on things, get some supplies. Will you and Emma be all right here for a few hours?" "We'll be fine," Katherine assured him. "You've already done so much for us." Brody nodded, donned his coat and hat, and headed out. The ride to his ranch gave him time to think, to process the unexpected turn his life had taken in the past 2 days. He had gone from solitary rancher to rescuer, and now found himself responsible for a widow and her infant daughter. The ranch house was a modest 2-bedroom structure Brody had built himself, with help from neighboring ranchers. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and comfortable, with a proper kitchen, a living area with a large stone fireplace, and bedrooms with real beds instead of cots. It would be a far better place for Katherine and Emma than the line shack. Brody checked on his small herd of cattle, finding them huddled in the shelter of a stand of pine trees, then attended to the few chickens and the milk cow he kept. Everything was in order, though the animals seemed glad to see him after his absence. Inside the house, Brody gathered supplies, food, extra blankets, some books he thought Katherine might enjoy. He hesitated at the door to the second bedroom, which contained a few items that had belonged to his mother, a quilt, some women's clothing he had never been able to part with. Perhaps Katherine could make use of them. By early afternoon, Brody had loaded a pack horse with supplies and was headed back to the line shack. As he rode, he found himself looking forward to seeing Katherine and Emma again, a novel sensation for a man accustomed to solitude. Katherine greeted him with a smile that transformed her face, erasing the worry lines that had marked it since they met. Emma was awake and alert, making small cooing sounds as she lay in her makeshift cradle. "We missed you," Katherine said, then blushed slightly. "I mean, it's very quiet here alone." "I brought supplies," Brody said, carrying in the first load of goods. "And I was thinking, if you're up to it, we could move to the ranch house tomorrow. It's more comfortable there, especially for the little one." Katherine's expression was a mix of relief and hesitation. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on your home." "It's a big house for one person," Brody assured her, "and it makes more sense for winter. Easier to keep warm. Closer to town if we need anything." "Town?" Katherine perked up. "How far is it?" "About 10 miles, Silver Creek. It's small, but it has the essentials general store, doctor, church." Katherine nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I could find work there eventually. I used to teach before I married Thomas." Brody considered this. "Silver Creek's got a schoolhouse, but I'm not sure if they have a teacher right now. Last one left before winter set in." Hope flickered in Katherine's eyes. "Really? That would give us a chance to start over." "One step at a time," Brody cautioned. "First, let's get you and Emma settled at the ranch. Then we can think about the future." That evening, as they shared a meal Brody had prepared from the supplies he'd brought, the atmosphere in the small cabin felt different. Despite the tragedy of Thomas's death, there was a tentative sense of possibility in the air, as if new paths were opening before them. Katherine spoke more openly about her life before her childhood in Illinois, her years teaching in a small school in Chicago, her meeting and courtship with Thomas. Brody found himself sharing stories of his own cattle drives under starlit skies, the satisfaction of building his ranch from nothing, even funny mishaps from his early days learning to be a cowboy. Emma lay contentedly in her cradle, occasionally making the small, happy sounds that infants make when they feel safe and loved. Outside, the temperature dropped, but inside the cabin, warmth and a fragile new friendship blossomed. The next morning brought preparations for the move to Brody's ranch. Katherine packed their few belongings, while Brody saddled the horses and secured the line shack. "What about—" Katherine hesitated, glancing toward the storage shed where Thomas's body lay. "I'll come back for him," Brody promised. "When the ground thaws, we'll lay him to rest proper." Katherine nodded gratefully, then allowed Brody to help her mount Cooper, Emma securely bundled against her chest. The journey to the ranch took longer than usual, as they traveled at a careful pace to avoid jostling the baby. When the ranch house came into view, Katherine couldn't help but gasp in appreciation. Though modest by Eastern standards, the sturdy log structure with its stone chimney and covered porch represented security and stability, things she had sorely lacked during the difficult journey west. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely, as Brody helped her dismount. "It's home," he replied simply, a note of pride in his voice. Inside, the house was neat and surprisingly comfortable. A large fireplace dominated the main room, with a kitchen area to one side and doors leading to 2 bedrooms. Brody quickly set about lighting the fire and showing Katherine around. "You and Emma can have this room," he said, opening the door to the slightly larger bedroom. "It gets the morning sun." Katherine stepped inside, touched by the care Brody had taken. The bed was freshly made with a colorful quilt, and he had even placed a small vase of dried wildflowers on the bedside table. "This is too kind," she murmured. "It's nothing," Brody replied, suddenly self-conscious. "The house has been needing a woman's touch for a long time." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with unintended meaning. Katherine busied herself with setting up a space for Emma, while Brody retreated to unload the horses. That evening, sitting before the fire, after Emma had been put to bed, Katherine broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. I want to contribute, she said firmly. I can cook, clean, mend whatever is needed. I won't be a charity case. Brody looked up from the bridle he was repairing. You're not charity, Katherine. You're a neighbor in need. Out here, that means something. Still, I need to feel useful, and eventually, I need to find a way to support Emma and myself. Brody nodded, understanding her pride. Tell you what help around the ranch as you're able, and when the weather improves, we'll ride into Silver Creek and see about that teaching position. Thank you, Katherine said softly, for everything. No need for thanks between friends, Brody replied, their eyes meeting briefly across the warm, fire-lit room. The days began to settle into a comfortable routine. Katherine took over the cooking and household tasks, while Brody tended to the ranch work. Together, they cared for Emma, whose sunny disposition and increasing alertness brought joy to the house. Christmas approached, bringing with it a sense of both melancholy and hope. Katherine couldn't help but think of the holiday she had expected to spend with Thomas, perhaps in Oregon by now. Instead, she found herself in a ranch house in Montana with a man who had been a stranger mere weeks ago. One evening, as a light snow fell outside, Brody returned from the barn with something hidden behind his back. Close your eyes, he instructed Katherine, who was sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts. She complied, a small smile playing at her lips. What are you up to, Brody Quinn? You'll see. Keep them closed. Katherine heard rustling, then the distinctive scent of pine filled the room. Can I look now? Go ahead. She opened her eyes to find a small pine tree standing in the corner of the room, its branches still dusted with snow. A Christmas tree, she breathed, delight spreading across her face. Thought the house could use some holiday cheer, Brody said, looking pleased with her reaction. And I found these in a trunk. He held out a small box containing simple ornaments, wooden stars, pine cones dipped in wax, a few glass balls carefully wrapped in cloth. They're beautiful, Katherine said, rising to examine them. Did they belong to your mother? Brody nodded. She loved Christmas, said even in hard times it was important to celebrate. She was right, Katherine agreed, taking the box from him. Shall we decorate it together? That evening, as they hung the ornaments on the small tree, something shifted between them. Perhaps it was the shared activity, or the way the firelight cast a warm glow over everything, or simply the natural progression of two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. Whatever the cause, there was a new awareness, a heightened sense of the other's presence. When their hands brushed as they reached for the same ornament, neither pulled away immediately. Katherine looked up, finding Brody's blue eyes fixed on her, with an expression that made her heart beat faster. Katherine, he said softly, her name a question and something more. Yes, she whispered. But Emma chose that moment to wake, her cry breaking the spell between them. Katherine stepped back, flustered, and hurried to attend to her daughter. Brody remained by the tree, wondering at the feelings stirring within him. It was too soon, he told himself. Katherine was still grieving her husband, still adjusting to her new circumstances, and yet he couldn't deny the growing attraction, the sense that she and Emma belonged here, with him. Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Brody rose early, as always, to tend to the animals, then returned to the house with a small surprise. Katherine was already up, preparing breakfast with Emma cradled in one arm. The domestic scene struck Brody with its rightness, as if his house had been waiting for this woman and child to complete it. "Merry Christmas," he said, setting a small package wrapped in brown paper on the table. Katherine looked up, surprise and pleasure lighting her face. "Merry Christmas. I have something for you too, though it's not much." They exchanged gifts after breakfast. Katherine had knitted Brody a new scarf from yarn she'd found in the house, working on it secretly during the evenings after he'd gone to bed. For Katherine, Brody had carved a small wooden rattle for Emma, and, more surprisingly, gifted a delicate silver brooch that had belonged to his mother. "I can't accept this," Katherine protested, holding the brooch carefully. "It's a family heirloom." "I want you to have it," Brody insisted. "It's been sitting in a drawer for years. My mother would have wanted it to be worn and appreciated." Katherine pinned it to her dress with trembling fingers, touched beyond words by the gesture. "Thank you," she said simply, reaching out to squeeze his hand. The day passed peacefully, with a special meal and stories shared by the fire. As night fell and Emma slept, Katherine and Brody sat side by side on the small sofa, watching the dying embers in the fireplace. "This has been the strangest and most wonderful Christmas I can remember," Katherine admitted. "A month ago, I never could have imagined being here." "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns," Brody agreed, "sometimes for the better." Katherine turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You saved us, Brody, not just from the blizzard, but from despair. I don't know what Emma and I would have done without you." "You would have managed," Brody said with conviction. "You're stronger than you know, Katherine." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then added softly, "And I'm grateful for you, for your kindness, your patience, everything." Their eyes held, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name, but both increasingly aware of. Winter settled in earnest across the Montana landscape. January brought frigid temperatures and more snow, confining them largely to the ranch house and nearby outbuildings. Brody continued his daily tasks caring for the livestock, chopping wood, making repairs, while Katherine managed the household and cared for Emma, who was growing and changing daily. During the long evenings, they developed a comfortable routine. Brody would read aloud from one of his books, mostly adventure tales and history, though he had a surprising collection of poetry as well, while Katherine sewed or knitted by the fire. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing stories of their pasts and, increasingly, thoughts of the future. Katherine spoke of her hope to teach again, to create a stable life for Emma. Brody found himself including them in his own plans, expansions to the ranch, improvements to the house. Neither explicitly stated what was becoming increasingly clear. They were beginning to think of themselves as a unit, a family in the making. In late January, a break in the weather provided an opportunity to travel to Silver Creek. Brody suggested the trip, knowing Katherine was eager to inquire about teaching possibilities, and also in need of supplies that couldn't be found at the ranch. The journey took most of the morning, with Emma bundled securely against the cold. Katherine's excitement grew as they approached the small settlement nestled in a valley between pine-covered hills. Silver Creek wasn't much compared to Chicago, just a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a modest steeple, and scattered houses. But to Katherine, after weeks at the isolated ranch, it represented connection to the wider world. Brody helped Katherine and Emma down from the wagon in front of the general store. "Let's get what we need here first, then we can ask about the school." Inside, the store was warm and crowded with goods barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of canned foods, tools, fabrics, and sundries of all kinds. The proprietor, a round-faced man with spectacles, greeted Brody by name. "Quinn, haven't seen you in a month of Sundays. Who've you got with you?" "George, this is Mrs. Katherine Miller and her daughter Emma," Brody said, a protective hand at Katherine's elbow. "They're staying at my place for the winter." George's eyebrows rose slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise with a welcoming smile. "Pleasure to meet you, madam. Any friend of Quinn's is welcome in Silver Creek." Katherine returned the greeting politely, aware of the curiosity in the shopkeeper's eyes. Their situation was unusual. She knew a widow and her baby living with a bachelor rancher would certainly set tongues wagging. As they gathered supplies, other customers entered the store, each reacting with similar curiosity to Katherine's presence. Brody introduced her to everyone, his manner suggesting that her residence at his ranch was the most natural thing in the world. When their shopping was complete, Brody suggested they visit the school next. The schoolhouse stood at the end of the main street, a simple one-room building with a bell tower. Unfortunately, they found it locked, with no sign of activity. "The school board president is Harold Winters," George informed them when they returned to the store to inquire. "He lives just past the church. If anyone knows about teaching positions, it would be him." Brody nodded his thanks, and they set off to find Harold Winters. The man, a stern-looking fellow with a neatly trimmed beard, listened to Katherine's inquiry with interest. "As a matter of fact, we are in need of a teacher," he confirmed. "Our last one left rather suddenly in November. The children have been without schooling since then." Hope bloomed in Katherine's chest. I have 3 years' experience teaching in Chicago, Mr. Winters. I would be very interested in the position. Winters studied her, his gaze flickering briefly to Emma in her arms, and then to Brody standing protectively beside them. The position would be available at the start of the spring term in April. Pay is $30 a month, with lodging provided above the schoolhouse. That sounds very fair, Katherine said eagerly. There is, however, the matter of your current living arrangement, Winters said delicately. Silver Creek is a small community with traditional values. The teacher is expected to set an example. Katherine flushed, understanding his implication. Mr. Quinn rescued my daughter and me during the blizzard in December. My husband perished in that storm. Mr. Quinn has kindly provided shelter while we get on our feet. Winters nodded, though he still looked skeptical. I see, and you would be moving into the teacher's quarters when you take the position? Yes, of course, Katherine agreed quickly, though the thought of leaving Brody's ranch caused an unexpected pang in her heart. Then I believe we can come to an arrangement, Winters concluded. Come see me in March, and we'll finalize the details. As they drove back to the ranch, Katherine's emotions were mixed. She was elated at the prospect of teaching again, of having a means to support herself and Emma, yet there was also a growing sadness at the thought of leaving the ranch that had become home, and the man who had become so much more than a rescuer or landlord. Brody, too, was quiet on the journey home, his thoughts turned inward. The idea of Katherine and Emma leaving in spring created a hollow feeling in his chest. He had grown accustomed to their presence, to the sounds of Katherine moving about the house, to Emma's coos and cries. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence was suddenly unbearable. That evening, after Emma was asleep, they sat by the fire as usual, but a new tension hung in the air between them. You'll make a fine teacher for Silver Creek, Brody said at last, breaking the silence. Thank you, Katherine replied, her fingers working steadily at her knitting. It's a relief to know Emma and I will have a secure future. You know, Brody began, then hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You don't have to leave the ranch. In spring, I mean. Katherine's hands stilled. Mr. Winters made it clear that the teacher is expected to live in the provided quarters. It's only 10 miles. You could stay here and ride to town each day to teach. Katherine looked up, searching his face. That would be quite a journey to make daily, especially with Emma. I could take you, Brody offered quickly, or we could get you your own horse and buggy. Brody, Katherine said gently, why would you want us to stay? The question hung between them, demanding an honest answer. Brody set aside the book he'd been pretending to read and met her gaze directly. Because the thought of this house, without you and Emma in it, is more than I can bear, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Because these past weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite the circumstances that brought you here. Katherine's eyes widened, her knitting forgotten in her lap. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Brody assured her, suddenly afraid he'd spoken too soon, pushed too hard. I understand it's too soon after Thomas. I just wanted you to know that you have options. It's not just about Thomas, Katherine said quietly. Though yes, his death is still fresh, it's about what people would think, what it would mean for Emma's future, for my reputation as a teacher. Brody nodded, understanding the complexity of their situation. In the small, conservative communities of the West, appearances mattered. A widow living with a single man, even one who had saved her life, would be subject to gossip and judgment. I respect that, he said finally. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Katherine reached across the space between them to touch his hand. Thank you for understanding, and for offering us a home here. It means more than I can say. Their fingers intertwined, a simple touch that conveyed what words could not yet express. Neither was ready to name the feelings growing between them, but neither could deny their existence anymore. February brought a brief thaw, enough to allow Brody to fulfill his promise to lay Thomas Miller to rest. He and 2 neighboring ranchers who had come to help dug a grave on a small rise overlooking a stream on Brody's property, a peaceful spot where wildflowers would bloom in spring. The small funeral was attended by Katherine, Emma, Brody, his neighbors, and a handful of townspeople from Silver Creek who had heard the story of the young family caught in the blizzard. The preacher from town said words over the simple wooden coffin Brody had made, and Katherine placed a small bunch of dried flowers on the grave. As the others departed, Katherine remained by the grave, Emma sleeping against her shoulder. Brody stood a respectful distance away, giving her time alone with her thoughts. "He had so many dreams," Katherine said eventually, aware of Brody's patient presence behind her. "That was what I loved about him, when we met, his optimism, his belief that anything was possible." Brody moved to stand beside her, his hat in his hands. "He must have been a good man." "He was," Katherine agreed. "Not perfect, too impulsive sometimes, too ready to chase the next opportunity without thinking it through. But he loved Emma and me, in his way." They stood in silence for a moment, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. "I think he would want us to be happy," Katherine said finally, turning to look at Brody. "To build a good life for Emma." "I think so too," Brody agreed softly. As they walked back to the house together, something had shifted between them once more. The act of laying Thomas to rest had closed one chapter and opened the possibility of another. The following weeks brought them closer still. With the pressure of uncertainty about Thomas removed, Katherine seemed more at ease, more willing to acknowledge the growing connection between herself and Brody. For his part, Brody found himself thinking of the future in new ways, not just the next season on the ranch, but years ahead, with Katherine and Emma beside him. March arrived with hints of spring longer days, patches of bare ground appearing beneath the melting snow, the return of birds from their winter sojourns. The land was awakening, and with it, a sense of anticipation and possibility. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Brody finally found the courage to speak what had been in his heart for weeks. "Katherine," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I know it hasn't been long since Thomas passed, and I understand if this is too soon, but I need to tell you how I feel." Katherine turned to look at him, her expression open and expectant. "I've fallen in love with you," Brody continued, the words finally free. "With both you and Emma. These months together have shown me what I was missing in my life, what this house was missing. And I know you're planning to take the teaching position in town, but I wanted to ask if you might consider a different arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Katherine asked softly, though the look in her eyes suggested she already knew. "Marriage," Brody said simply. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, letting me be a father to Emma, making this ranch our home together." Katherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were accompanied by a smile that lit her entire face. "Oh, Brody." "I know it's sudden," he hurried on. "We could wait, announce an engagement now, and marry in the summer, if that seems more proper. I just couldn't bear the thought of you leaving without knowing how I feel, without offering you this choice." Katherine reached for his hand, her touch warm and sure. "It is sudden, by conventional standards. But nothing about our meeting or our time together has been conventional." "Is that a yes?" Brody asked, hardly daring to hope. "It's a yes," Katherine confirmed, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I love you too, Brody Quinn. I think I have for longer than I've been willing to admit to myself." Brody's face broke into a grin of pure joy. He drew her into his arms, holding her close, as if afraid she might disappear. When they finally pulled apart, he cupped her face gently in his hands. "May I kiss you, Katherine Miller?" "Please," she whispered. Their first kiss was tender and hesitant, then deepening with the release of long, restrained emotion. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "What about the teaching position?" Brody asked, suddenly remembering. Katherine considered this. "I still want to teach. The school needs a teacher, and I need to use my skills to contribute." "Of course," Brody agreed immediately. "We'll make it work. I'll drive you to town each day, or we'll get you that buggy we talked about." "And Emma? She'll come with us some days. Other days, Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring ranch might help. She's mentioned several times how much she misses having little ones around." Brody squeezed Katherine's hand. "We'll figure it out together." That night, as Katherine lay in her bed with Emma sleeping peacefully in the cradle Brody had crafted, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. From the terror of the blizzard, to the grief of losing Thomas, to the unexpected joy of finding love again, it seemed almost too much for one lifetime. Yet, it felt right. as if the trials had been necessary to lead her to this place, this man, this future. Thomas would always be Emma's father, always have a place in their hearts. But Brody, steady, kind, loving Brody, would be the one to help raise her, to shape her future. 2 days later, they rode into Silver Creek together to share their news. Their first stop was Harold Winter's home to discuss the teaching position. "Married?" Winters repeated, looking between them with surprise. "Well, that certainly changes things." "I still very much want the position, Mr. Winters," Katherine assured him. "My husband to be fully supports my teaching career." Winters stroked his beard thoughtfully. The board had concerns about a single mother's ability to manage both teaching and child care, but as Mrs. Quinn, with support at home, he nodded decisively. "Yes, I believe this arrangement will work nicely." Their next stop was the church, where they arranged with the pastor to be married in 3 weeks' time, soon enough to satisfy their hearts, but with sufficient notice to avoid appearing scandalous to the community. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Silver Creek. To Katherine's relief, the reaction was largely positive. The romantic story of her rescue during the blizzard, followed by their growing love through the winter months, appealed to the frontier spirit of the community. That Brody Quinn, long considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the area, had finally found a bride was cause for celebration. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with the scent of spring in the air. Katherine wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, with Brody's mother's brooch pinned at her throat. Emma, now 6 months old and sitting up on her own, wore a matching blue ribbon in her fair hair. The small church was filled with neighbors, townspeople, and the few friends Brody had made during his years in Montana. As Katherine walked down the aisle toward Brody, who stood tall and proud in a new black suit, she felt a sense of rightness that overwhelmed any lingering doubts. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken clearly for all to hear. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Brody's kiss was gentle but full of promise, drawing approving smiles and a few happy tears from those watching. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food provided by neighbors in the tradition of frontier hospitality. Katherine moved among the guests with Emma in her arms, now officially Mrs. Quinn, the transition feeling both momentous and completely natural. "Happy?" Brody asked, finding a moment alone with her as the celebration continued around them. "More than I ever thought possible," Katherine replied honestly. "It feels like coming home, even though I've only known this place a few months." "It was waiting for you," Brody said simply, "just as I was." That night, after the guests had departed and Emma was asleep in the nursery Brody had created by converting his small office, husband and wife retired to the master bedroom together for the first time. There was a moment of shyness between them, despite the months of growing closeness. "I never thought I'd find love again," Katherine admitted, as Brody took her hands in his. "Especially not so soon, so unexpectedly." "Life has a way of surprising us," Brody replied, drawing her closer. "When I rode out that day into the blizzard, checking fences was all I had on my mind. Instead, I found my future. Their coming together as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a culmination of months of growing feelings and the promise of a lifetime ahead." Afterward, Katherine lay in Brody's arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his fingers gently combing through her hair. "That sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best," she replied. "That storm nearly killed Emma and me, but it also brought us to you." "I thank God every day that I heard your cry on the wind," Brody said, his voice husky with emotion. "That I found you in time." Spring bloomed across the Montana landscape, transforming the ranch with new growth and color. Katherine began teaching at the Silver Creek School, quickly winning the hearts of her students and the respect of their parents. Brody, true to his word, ensured she had reliable transportation to and from town each day, often accompanying her himself. Emma thrived in her new life, growing stronger and more curious by the day. She took her first steps in the kitchen of the ranch house, toddling unsteadily from Katherine to Brody, who recorded the milestone in the family Bible with a proud, slightly shaky hand. By summer, Katherine had settled fully into her dual roles as teacher and rancher's wife. She learned to ride properly, to help with some of the ranch work, and to manage the expanding vegetable garden she had planted near the house. Brody, in turn, became an attentive father to Emma, never differentiating between his stepdaughter and his own blood. In July, Katherine shared news that brought even greater joy to their household. She was expecting a child, due to arrive in the early months of the new year. Brody's reaction was one of pure elation, lifting Katherine in his arms and spinning her around until she laughingly protested. "Another baby," he marveled, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our family is growing." "Emma will have a brother or sister," Katherine said, watching as the toddler played contentedly with wooden blocks Brody had carved for her. "I never imagined such happiness could be possible again." As Katherine's pregnancy progressed, they prepared the house for the new arrival. Brody built a proper crib and expanded the nursery to accommodate both children. Katherine sewed tiny garments in the evenings, often with Emma helping by handing her scraps of fabric. Winter returned to Montana, but this time Katherine faced it without fear. The ranch house was warm and secure, their pantry well stocked, their hearts full. On Christmas Eve, almost exactly a year after Brody had brought home the small pine tree that had marked their first holiday together, they sat by the fireplace reflecting on the extraordinary year behind them. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Katherine asked, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "If the storm hadn't come that day, if you hadn't found us?" "I try not to," Brody admitted. "The thought of you and Emma out there alone—" He shook his head, unwilling to complete the thought. "But fate had other plans for us." "Indeed it did," Katherine agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "I believe Thomas would be happy, knowing Emma and I found you." "I'll make sure she knows about him as she grows," Brody promised. "About her father, who loved her enough to risk everything for a better future." Katherine squeezed his hand gratefully. "And about the man who became her father in all the ways that truly matter." In late January, as another Montana blizzard raged outside, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Brody paced anxiously in the living room, while the doctor and a neighbor woman attended to Katherine, Emma watching her father's nervous movements with curious eyes. When the doctor finally emerged to announce the successful delivery, Brody rushed to Katherine's side. She lay exhausted but radiant in their bed, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Meet your son," she said softly as Brody approached with wonder on his face. The baby was perfect, red-faced and squalling, with a dusting of dark hair that promised to match his father's. Brody took him carefully, tears unashamedly streaming down his face as he held his child for the first time. "What shall we name him?" Katherine asked, watching the love bloom on her husband's face. "Benjamin," Brody suggested. "After my father, if that's all right with you." "Benjamin Quinn," Katherine repeated, tasting the name. "It's perfect." Emma, brought in to meet her new brother, regarded the baby with solemn interest before declaring, "Baby," in her small but decisive voice, drawing laughter from both parents. As the family gathered on the bed, the howling blizzard outside seemed to echo the one that had brought them together just over a year before, but this time there was no fear, only gratitude for the storm that had changed the course of their lives. Spring came again to Montana, bringing with it the first anniversary of Brody and Katherine's wedding. The ranch flourished under their joint care, with new calves in the pasture and flowers blooming in Katherine's expanded garden. Emma, now an energetic toddler, chased butterflies across the yard, while Benjamin, robust at 3 months, watched from his cradle on the porch. Katherine continued teaching, though she had taken a brief leave after Benjamin's birth. The school board, impressed with her dedication and skill, had increased her salary and offered her a permanent position. Brody's ranch too prospered, allowing them to hire occasional help and plan for future expansions. On a warm evening in May, they sat together on the porch swing Brody had built, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. Emma had fallen asleep on a blanket nearby, and Benjamin dozed in Katherine's arms. "I was thinking," Brody said, his arm around Katherine's shoulders, "about that day in the blizzard, how close I came to missing you entirely." Katherine leaned into his embrace. "But you didn't. You heard us. You found us. You saved us." "You saved me too," Brody replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. I didn't know how empty my life was until you filled it." As darkness fell over the Montana landscape, the lights from the ranch house glowed warmly, a beacon of the love and family that had grown from a chance encounter in a blizzard. Inside those walls, two people who had found each other against all odds continued to build a life together, their shared past a foundation for a future rich with promise. For Brody and Katherine Quinn, the storm had indeed brought an unexpected blessing, not just shelter from the cold, but a love that would warm their hearts for all the days to come.